Kata for the sound of the bell. Mind calm, body at ease, breathing quiet, sentiment benevolent. Dharma friends, sitting still in vital silence, we practice eco-Buddhism together. The sound of the temple bell booms for all to cease from conflict. May the way of Buddha usher in the dawn of non-violent global village forever. Here is the after sound of the bell. Thunder of silence, light after Dharma rain. Om Amoga Vairocana Mahamudra Mani Padma Chavataya Pravartaya
Please stand for the chanting of the three refuges.
Ishim Quimyam Ne Shivam Samse Chemam Chale Sangju Il-che Putaya Ajun Shishim Quimyam Ne Shivam Samse
Shisim Quimyam Shivang Samse Chemang Chale Samju Ilche Please repeat after me the English version. I go for refuge to the Buddha.
I go for refuge to the Buddha
And resolve with all beings.
and resolve with all beings.
I will cultivate a heart of enlightenment.
I will cultivate a heart of enlightenment
And realize the great way.
and realize the great way.
I go for refuge to the Dharma.
I go for refuge to the Dharma
And resolve with all beings.
and resolve with all beings.
I will penetrate the teachings.
I will penetrate the teachings
And uncover oceans of wisdom.
and uncover oceans of wisdom.
I go for refuge to the Sangha.
I go for refuge to the Sangha
And resolve with all beings.
and resolve with all beings.
I will seek peace and happiness for the many.
I will seek peace and happiness for the many
And transform this world into Buddha lands unimpeded.
and transform this world into Buddha lands unimpeded.
Please return now for a 5-minute meditation period before a special Dharma talk by our member and Dharma student, senior Dharma student, Jaguar, Kelly Davenport. Please follow along with these simple stretching, kind of mindfulness exercises. Fully present, moment by moment, little by little. Aware of body and breath. From time to time, taking a deep breath. Breathing in this position. We're inhaling as we open our bodies and exhaling long, slow as we fold. Inhaling, coming up again, and fold. And coming up. The more present we are, the more precious the moments. And changing direction. Breathing as we go up to the top, in, and then exhaling down and around. This is energizing for our spine and our whole nervous system when we do the twisting. Yes, please bring your hands palm to palm as we listen to Maum read to us from the Dhammapada. It's just a few beautiful lines. So please bring your presence.
There is no fire like passion. There are no chains like hate. Illusion is a net, desire a rushing river. How easy it is to see your brother or sister's faults. How hard to face your own. You winnow theirs in the wind like chaff, but yours you hide like a cheat, covering up an unlucky throw.
Sunshine. 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 Good morning, everyone. This is a little special time of the year here at the temple. We've just passed March 3rd, which is our founder, Venerable Samusunam's birthday. And so his picture is here behind me on the altar with a candle. And we appreciate his many Dharma offerings since he arrived here in North America in 1967. And because he came from Korea, sometimes we don't know so much about this Korean Zen tradition that we're practicing. And I was very touched when our speaker this morning, as part of her seminary presentations, gave a talk about Korean food and nutriments to our training students. And it helped me anyway, understand our Korean tradition better, and perhaps how our teacher was affected by that tradition. So I like to introduce, and I think many of you know, Jaguar, Kelly Davenport. She's our senior Dharma student for this Sangha, who, when we have our annual meeting and retreat in July, will be ordained as a Dharma teacher. So, Jaguar, are you there?
Good morning, Haju. Good morning, everyone. I have the chat box up here, so it's nice to see everyone saying hello. And if you have any questions or comments during the talk, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be able to see them. But also, if you can't hear me at any point, please put that in the chat too, and then I will know. So thank you again for inviting me to give this talk. You know, I was looking back through my notes, and one of the first Dharma talks that I ever gave to a Sunday morning service was about the Four Nutriments. And that comes from a sutra called the Ahara Sutra, which I'll talk a little bit about today. But the sort of the crux of the teaching in that is that all beings subsist on nutriment. And according to the Buddha, if we can understand this fact about life, it will reveal a truth that leads to the root of our existence and to the uprooting of suffering. And so I probably chose to study the Four Nutriments because on some subconscious level, it sounded like the closest thing to food, and I love food. Many of you may know that about me. I love cooking and baking bread, which I've talked a little bit about with this group before. I love thinking about food, planning what to cook, shopping for the ingredients, preparing the food, and of course, eating it. So as I've been studying our history of Korean Buddhism over the last year or so, it's perhaps no surprise that I've been really interested in stories of Korean food, of cooking practice, and some of the sort of monastic rituals surrounding food preparation and eating. So in an ideal world, we would be sharing a meal today, maybe some rice and kimchi, one of the dishes that I'm going to talk about today, but that will have to wait for another time. So for the talk today, I wanted to kind of position Korean Buddhism and Korean culture through that lens of food and cooking, but also revisit that teaching of the four nutriments, because the first of the four nutriments is physical food. And by looking at Korean Buddhism and culture through the lens of food, I'm also interested in asking the question of what is Korean about Korean Buddhism? Some of us might only know a little bit about our Korean lineage and encounter it through some of the rituals or the Korean chants that we do at the temple. So this is perhaps an opportunity to add a little bit of knowledge here. But I'm also interested in asking the question of what is Korean about Korean Buddhism in America? Or what is American about American Buddhism? Because we are obviously not practicing in Korea anymore. And so what can we learn about our particular place and time and the way that our tradition through a Korean lineage is taking root in our country? Okay, so that's a little bit of the overview. The first part for my talk, I want to look at some of the monastic traditions around food and cooking. And this particular book has been a really great reference. I'll try and show some pictures from it in a slideshow here in a minute. And we'll see if I can do that skillfully. But the book is called The Zen Monastic Experience by Robert Buswell. And at the time that he wrote it, he was a young American academic and a student of Buddhism who lived in a Korean monastery for, I think, a few years. And he wrote about his time there in the late 1970s, early 80s. So about 40 years ago. And I was especially interested to read his account of each of the specialized jobs that help the monastery to function. The monasteries in Korea are often not located near a population center. And so they're very sort of self-contained little cities. So they may have a farm. Obviously, there's a lot of kitchen work, everything from sewing to accounting to event planning to special rituals and all of those sorts of duties. But until I read this, what I didn't know is that the monks whose assigned roles were one of those specialized support roles, they don't actually practice meditation. There's actually a separate group of meditation monks who spend the majority of their time in sitting practice. And then behind the scenes are all of these monks supporting the effort. So the kitchen monks, the carpenters, the sewists, and so on. And I want to read a little bit about what Buswell says about these working monks, so to speak. So the teacher who's referenced here is Kusan Sunim. So he was the head teacher of the monastery at the time that Robert Buswell was living there. In a Dharma talk, Kusan once described the many monks holding support roles in the monastery as living Dharma protectors, popyo, like the heavenly kings who guard the front entrance of the temple from baleful influences. They are charged with handling all the daily pressures and tasks facing the monastery, so as to free the meditators and scholars from unnecessary distractions. The success of the large monastery as practice center is directly dependent upon the success of these monks in discharging their responsibilities in financial matters, agriculture, and edification. Indeed, I found it one of the most striking paradoxes of the monastic institution that on the shoulders of those monks least involved in the putative raison d'etre of some monks, meditation, is supported the entire practice edifice of the monastery. I hope to show here that even though many of the most dedicated and active monks in some monasteries do little, if indeed any meditation themselves, they have forged for themselves vocations that are absolutely essential to the continued viability of the Sun tradition. And he goes on to describe the most common of these, I think, 47 different offices that are held by these support monks. And as you read the account, you really come to see how, while we may not think of these monks as traditional meditation monks, they bring such a spirit of practice into their regular duties that it seemingly is inseparable from the practice of the meditation monks themselves, which I was really drawn to because I myself feel that my practice is often most alive when I'm doing things off of the meditation cushion, cooking or sewing or things like this. So let's look a little bit at the kitchen staff then. And we may be familiar with the Japanese term tenzo. We actually use this term at the temple to describe the person who is the head cook for our retreats, an important job. And it literally means something like master of ceremonies in Japanese. But that term is not actually used in Korean monasteries, at least according to this book. Instead, the head of the kitchen is known as the wanju, kind of similar term, master of campus, and oversees the kitchen and the cellar where all the ingredients and groceries are kept. And then most of the kitchen staff itself is composed of novice monks who are maybe practicing their memorization and sutra study in the midst of doing kitchen labor. And they actually, at this time anyway, lived together as a group in the kitchen compound itself. So really a kind of live-work arrangement. And then finally, Buswell also notes that some of the hardest workers in the monastery kitchen are actually laywomen. And they may be known as posalnim, posal being the Sino-Korean translation of a bodhisattva. And these may be women who are divorced or widowed or who are abandoned by their husbands. And so their work in the monastery supports their families. And Buswell notes that they could earn an allowance of $40 a month plus room and board, which at the time was a pretty decent wage. So in the monastery, meals are called kongyang, which translates to offerings. And if you are familiar with the longer version of our Three Refuges chant called the Yebol that we do when we sing the incense offering portion of it, this is part of the longer evening version of that chant. That word kongyang or offering appears there too. And this is in contrast to sort of the colloquial Korean term for a meal, which would be bap, which literally translates to a meal of rice, sort of a staple dish. And meals in the monastery themselves are very simple. Steamed rice, tea made from the leftover rice cooking water, some type of simple vegetable or a kimchi soup, cooked black beans flavored with soy, red pepper paste, and sometimes tofu. And when I was giving this talk to our training students a few weeks ago, someone noted quite quickly, hey, that's the breakfast that we have at the temple. So there's some tradition for that, certainly. And then one of the other sources that I was looking at to try and find a little bit more detail about this experience of working in the monastery kitchen, because I haven't found a lot in English that's been written about this, but luckily our own founder, Samu Sunam, who Haji just mentioned, wrote an account of his whole life really, but especially about his early years as a novice monk in Korea working in a monastery kitchen. And this was published in the early 1980s as part of our Zen Lotus Society handbook. The Zen Lotus Society was the original name of our organization. And I'm going to try to show a couple of pictures while I read this from Sunam here. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see this picture. So this is the cover of that book that I mentioned, the Zen Monastic Experience. And I originally thought that this was a painting. It's actually a photograph. So this is monks harvesting rice on the monastery grounds. Presumably they had a rice field and a farm there in the late 1970s. And then another photo from that same book, preparing the evening rice at an outdoor kitchen in these big cauldrons, also in the late 70s. So here is what Sunam wrote about working in the kitchen. I was called a kyongju, which means master of offering or one who makes an offering. It is a name given to the temple cooks who cook rice and make an offering of the rice to Buddha before the community partakes of the meal. Although the name sounds lofty, it is a humble position usually occupied by novice monks working in temple kitchens. Although we were told not to waste anything, it was so easy to waste something. For instance, we washed and rinsed a lot of rice for every meal, hundreds of thousands of grains. If we were not careful, A few grains would easily run off through our fingers and end up down the drain. We were told that guardians would stand on guard, lamenting over the waste until the grains in the drain rotted away. We were very much alarmed and became extra careful. Working in the temple kitchen went largely unrecognized. This is why novice training traditionally begins with working in the kitchen, where one can refine and transform oneself unknowingly into a bodhisattva. There is a saying in Korean monasteries, there is no one who cannot attain Buddhahood after 9 years of Kyungju service. All right. And then one more picture here of the monks having their evening meal. Okay, so I'll show a few more pictures in a little bit, but so now that we've heard a little bit about sort of the cooking and eating traditions in the Korean monastery, I want to look more specifically at 2 dishes in particular that could be called Korean national dishes. So the first one is kimchi, which I bet many people are familiar with. And the second one you may not have heard of is called Budejige, which is a kind of stew. The first dish is a traditional, very old Korean dish. And the second is much more contemporary and dates to the era immediately after the Korean War. And I chose these 2 in particular because I think they tell us something important about Korean culture and history. Okay, so the first is kimchi. And I would say it would be difficult to overstate the importance and status of kimchi in Korean food culture. Kimchi and the sort of communal labor to produce it, which is almost a sort of festive atmosphere, and it's called kimjang, has actually earned the designation of UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. Kimchi has its own museum in Seoul and has even been sent into space in 2008, according to a New York Times article that I found. The government actually spent several years and millions of dollars specifically engineering 9 Korean dishes that would be safe for space travel, including a bacterialess kimchi that tasted good but was inert, in case anything strange happened in space, I guess. And the practice of fermenting vegetables is common across many, many cultures. Perhaps you're more familiar with German sauerkraut, for example. But in Korea, it dates to at least the 3 Kingdoms period, which is the period right before and after the Common Era. And I found this beautiful poem from a 13th century Korean writer named Yi Gyobu, who talks about eating radish kimchi. So he writes, "Pickled radish slices make a good summer side dish. Radish preserved in salt is a winter side dish from start to end. The roots in the earth grow plumper every day. Harvesting after the frost, a slice cut by a knife tastes like a pear." I love that. So as a food, kimchi is very simple. It is a selection of pickled vegetables and then soaked in a salt brine and slathered in a red pepper paste, and usually a fermented fish of some kind, and then is allowed to bubble away until it becomes tangy and preserved. And this process is called lactofermentation. You might be familiar with making yogurt. Some of those same bacteria are involved here. The most common type of kimchi is made with cabbage, but other popular varieties are radish or cucumber, as we heard in our poem. And let me see if I can show a picture of some of our kimchi here. I share my screen. Okay, so here is that cabbage kimchi or beichu kimchi. Beichu is cabbage, I believe. And then here are some many different kinds of kimchis from the Museum Kimchi-kan in Seoul, which I mentioned. And South Korea, I didn't realize quite how small it was in terms of land mass. It's roughly the size of Indiana, and North Korea is roughly the size of Mississippi. So the whole Korean peninsula is fairly small in terms of landmass, heavily mountainous, And so there's not a lot of land suitable for farming. It makes sense why a really hardy vegetable like cabbage, which then can be preserved and made even more delicious as kimchi, would play a central role in the Korean diet. And in monasteries, kimchi is also a major source of vitamin C during the winter and could be the only vegetable available to the monks for many months all throughout the winter. And in his book, Buswell talks about what a huge project it is every year to put up enough kimchi to last the winter for all the monks, a few hundred people. And the timing of this is very careful. So it has to be cold enough to properly preserve and store the kimchi, which is buried in these big pots in the ground. And so it's often on the first snowfall that a kimjang season has arrived, Buswell writes. He has this wonderful account of all of the monks kind of pitching in to make this happen. So at the time that he was writing, it took about 3 days to make all the kimchi, beginning with harvesting the cabbages and radishes in the field, ferrying them down on these big wooden A-frame backpacks to the river where the monastery was located. And then they had these big wooden troughs. And he said one of the worst jobs was to be assigned to wash all of the vegetables in the frozen over river. You might have to kind of chisel the ice away to get these wooden troughs in. And then while they had gloves, obviously it was still quite cold, kind of using this cold river water to get the dirt off of the vegetables that had been harvested. After that, the salt and the pepper paste, and then being stuffed into these big earthenware jars called hungari. Let's see, I think I might have a picture. So this is from a really wonderful New York Times article, again, from this past year, from a Kimjang festival in Gosan, South Korea, which I guess is known for its kimchi tradition. So this is sort of the modern equivalent of that. And kimchi is also a food that makes use of fermentation, which I mentioned. Those lactobacilli, the little microorganisms that make yogurt tangy, that make sourdough bread delicious. Those are also present naturally in our environment, on our hands, on vegetables. And so this process of kimchi making is sort of an alchemy of fermentation. And it allows kimchi to be turned into something that is a little bit more healthful and delicious than just the simple ingredients would seem to suggest. So there are something like 30 different microorganisms present in naturally fermented kimchi. They help give it that sort of tangy, fizzy flavor and texture. And as I mentioned, they're naturally present in the environment on the vegetables, even in a well-used fermentation jar themselves. And I think I have a picture of the fermentation jars. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. These are quite big. There's no person here for scale, but these are a few feet around and would be buried partially in the ground to preserve them and keep the temperature at a relatively steady state. Okay. So one of the things that I was most inspired by in doing some of this research is learning about this particular special term in Korea that is used to talk about the ineffable quality of homemade food and has sort of an association with fermented food. And it is sonmat, S-O-N-M-A-T, which literally translates as hand taste, or even the connotation of mother's hand taste. And I want to read some words from a Korean artist named Jiwon Woo. She did this really cool art installation to explore the concept of sonmat. I believe she describes herself as a bio artist. So she does both sort of science experiments and art and combines them in interesting ways. And so this particular exhibit was around looking at the microbial cultures from the hands of multiple generations of women who were Korean and made some of these traditional foods. I have a picture, I think, of that. Here we go. So she writes, contact of food with the hands of the cook is an essential part of Korean cuisine. The Korean word sonmat, meaning hand taste, relates to a compliment in response to excellent culinary abilities. If someone is a good cook, the compliment would express that that person possesses good hand taste. Significantly, the word also connotes associations to family history, particularly the wisdom of ancestors, and gratitude toward nature. Sanmat is a mechanism for triggering special memories and a deep sense of belonging through the act of eating, as the knowledge of producing a particular sanmat is a quality passed down generationally. All right. So through this biological art project, she actually discovered that across 3 generations of Korean women living in different parts of the world, their hand microbiome was similar within the family. And so thinking about kimchi, I am reminded of a presentation that Nawara, one of our Chicago teachers, gave a few years ago, again about that chant Yebol, a short version of which we do at this service. And she had specifically looked into some of the meaning of the section that we chant in the morning, which I believe is not translated in our Moon Journeying Through Clouds book. And I remember that Nawara had asked Sunim about that section. And he explained that the morning Yebol section talks about a tea offering on the altar. However, in Korean monasteries at certain points in history, there may not have been any tea. And so the devotion of the practitioners is said to be the magic of turning tea or turning water into tea on the altar, even though there may be no tea leaves. So sort of this idea of a spiritual fermentation, maybe. All right, so I'm just gonna pause for a minute and see if there is any other. Of course, I lost the chat box now. See if there's any other questions. Nope, looks like we're good. Okay. All right. So let's get the second dish then, second and final. This is the more contemporary dish called Budejige, and it originated in South Korea after the Korean War, so much more recent. And its name is translated as military camp stew or army stew, and jjigae is stew. So you may have seen even a kimchi jjigae, which is a kimchi stew. And I actually wasn't taught that much about the Korean War in school. I had to do a little bit of reading to know more of the kind of basic history of that time period. Many of you may know more about it. But what I found is that after a 40-year period of Japanese occupation in Korea, the Korean War broke out on the peninsula. And that is what brought American military troops to the region as a kind of proxy war with the communist powers of the USSR and China. And after the war was an extremely difficult period in Korean history. A lot of the farmland in Korea was destroyed, and as we said earlier, there wasn't that much to begin with because of the rugged terrain there. And there was an estimated quarter of the population that was starving. So those who could foraged for wild foods or hunted for game. Many other people begged food from American military bases or even picked through the garbage to find leftovers that were edible. And I found an amazing essay by a Korean American sociologist and anthropologist, Grace M. Cho, who writes about military camp stew and how it was invented during this time of starvation. So she writes, "Word spread that American soldiers stationed there had an endless supply of food, with portions so big that they could afford to throw food away. The bases became destinations for hungry Koreans who scavenged or purchased the remnants. As some survivors recalled, this food was not exactly palatable. It was often a melange of various food scraps mixed with inedible things such as cigarette butts. They recalled that though the food was sometimes disgusting, it kept them alive. Some people would sort through the scraps and find a perfectly intact pink slab of jellied ham and put it in a stew. What the Americans didn't finish, Koreans used to make the first iterations of Budejige. I first came to know Budejige as a kind of cultural icon circulating among Korean diasporic artists in the United States, who regarded it as both a culinary travesty and an iconic symbol of US imperialism. I listened to the oral histories of Korean War survivors living in the United States, who spoke about the days during and after the war when they sought food outside US Army bases. They recalled waiting in long lines outside the mess halls to buy bags of, quote, leftovers, though some of them referred to the bags plainly as garbage. They'd say things like, Americans have the best food and throw it away, and then Koreans buy that garbage. Their voices filled with humiliation, resentment, and gratitude all at once. All right, so I have a couple pictures from that era as well. So this is a photo from the early 1950s from the Korea Times. Civilians, some in traditional dress or hanbok, lining up to flee areas of conflict at a train. I think that's an American service person on the train there. And so there was actually a black market for preserved meat products like Spam, which is referenced in that part of the essay, because they were so precious and added of really much needed protein to the diet of hungry Koreans. At one point during the post-war era, the smuggling of Spam was a serious crime. But today, this stew of Budejige, or military-based stew, is known to younger Koreans as a comfort food or even a hangover remedy. Here's a picture of it, looking like an interesting amalgamation of things. Today in a restaurant, it could include things like hot dogs, Spam, even baked beans and American cheese, which are things that would have been left over as American military staples. And then it's all mixed together into this spicy ramen soup. So as an American, I actually, as I said, I knew very little about the Korean War or much about the impact on the Korean people. And I really appreciated just this little glimpse into our shared history as peoples and countries. And to me, the story of this stew also reflects the resilience of the Korean people. And again, this theme of alchemy, like we see with kimchi, transforming ingredients that may be lowly into something delicious or at least sustaining, even as the dish itself may still carry some feelings of sorrow or even shame of that period following the war when so many people were struggling. All right, so coming back now to some of our Buddhist tradition. And perhaps you have sensed some of the themes I'm trying to illustrate with these stories: resilience, alchemy, simplicity, thrift, tradition, and intimate relationship with nature. And I think that these really tell us a lot about Korean history and culture, at least from what I have read. And I think we also see many of these same themes in our particular flavor of Buddhism, our Korean lineage. You may have heard the famous koan from the Korean master Chinol from a fairly modern time period, who would challenge his students to ponder the phrase, "It is better to eat one meal mindfully than to save 100,000 lives." And perhaps you've heard stories from our own Haju Sunam, from the early days of our community here in Ann Arbor, making meals on retreats and being told to make a meal with only 5 ingredients, both I think for reasons of simplicity, but also because there were 20 or 30 people to feed on a retreat, and the food was very simple things like potatoes. So I want to return now to the teaching of the Four Nutriments. And this is one of the teachings transmitted directly from the Buddha that, of course, predates Korea's own incarnation of Buddhism. And as I mentioned at the very start, this teaching is outlined in the sutra called the Ahara Sutra. And Ahara Ahara, comes from the Pali word for food. And it also has parallels to the word upadana, which means clinging, but can also mean sustenance. So interesting kind of double meaning. And from my research, I found that the Buddha originally delivered this teaching at a time when his Sangha had become more established and had more lay supporters than they might have had at the beginning of his teaching career. And so they had been sort of lavished with this delicious food because, of course, the monks take their food only as alms rounds or what is given to them. And the Buddha feared that the monks were becoming lazy and were taking for granted all of these beautiful meals. There's actually a wonderful commentary about this sutra on the Access to Insight website, which is a free website where you can read a lot about some of the original sutras. And the commentary is by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, a modern scholar and teacher. So I recommend that you check that out if you're interested in this. But the Ahara Sutra itself is quite short. It's quite stark. And in it, the Buddha outlines the four nutriments. So what he describes as the four elements that humans use as sustenance. And I think, again, that double meaning of clinging is present here too. So those are physical food, sense impressions or contact with the world through the senses, intellectual intention or volition. So maybe we could say that's like willpower, and then consciousness. And he tells a parable or metaphor about each element, but I'm just going to talk about that first one of food since that's the topic of this talk. So the parable that he uses to teach about physical food is that of a husband and wife who are trying to cross a desert with their young son, and they run out of food and begin to starve. They fear that they will die in the desert and all three of them will perish. And they're trying to decide what to do. So completely heartbroken, they decide that if they kill and eat their young son, they may survive to have another child after they make it across the desert. And I think, you know, the crux of this story is that they come to deeply know the sacredness of nourishment as well as that suffering that's bound up in it. And this is a really hard sutra to read, at least for me. It's pretty heartbreaking, and some of the other metaphors are similarly powerful and raw. And I have reflected on this sutra a lot over the last few years since I first read it, because as I said, I love food. I have a lot of attachments to food. And I think what I've come to in terms of my understanding of it at this point is that I see it very much in line with the Four Noble Truths. The notion that there is inherent suffering about the human experience, just as a result of us being human. And I really see this teaching as being about embracing that human frailty and suffering as the site of awakening and not as an impediment to it. And I think it's especially poignant to me, and maybe it's just because it has more personal meaning to me, is that this teaching is delivered around the habit of hunger. We could say hunger is a habit, I suppose, or a physical need. But that's a habit that as long as we're alive, we will have. We're going to get hungry, we're going to need to eat, and then the whole process starts all over again. And there can be a lot of suffering bound up in all of that. And so I think what this teaching is about is really about embracing that experience of humanity and to come to know it intimately. And, you know, looking back at some of these Korean dishes that are fermented, I started to think about the idea of a spiritual fermentation. What does that really look like? Because as I have been practicing in this community for the last few years, I really see that slow kind of transformation, the parts of our tradition that are Korean, the parts that are American, the influence of teachers in our tradition and our Sangha members, all of you, And how does that all get turned into something a little bit fizzier, a little bit more pure? And I also think that we're very much in the midst of digesting Korean Buddhism as a tradition and kind of figuring out how does this lineage fit in this time and place with American culture and American beliefs and values. And so the question that I posed at the beginning, I don't have a good answer for yet. What does it mean to practice Korean Buddhism as an American? But I think it's an important one to ask ourselves because, again, whether we notice it or not, this fermentation of ourselves and our lineage and our current cultural context is always happening in the background. And so maybe that metaphor of kimchi is the best example I can come up with at this point. It's a 3,000-year-old tradition, but it manifests out of our own hands, which are unique. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about Korean food. I'm going to see if I can pull up the comments again in case there was any questions or anything anyone wondered about. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with me, and I will turn it back over to Haju and Mahum.
So thank you very much for your Dharma talk today, Jaguar. It's wonderful to look at our practice in a very embodied way. And I think as we look at food and history and all of this, that allows us to do that. So I'm going to do a few announcements and then we'll turn it back over to Haji Sunam. So I would encourage you to sign up for our e-bulletin if you have not already signed up. All of the events that I'm talking about are listed there, and there will be links to the virtual events. So today and every Sunday after service, there is a recovery Dharma meeting. And during the week then, our standard events are Wednesday evening service from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And Thursday morning, there's a Thursday morning study group on Way of the Bodhisattva. So if you, I'm sorry, there's a Wednesday morning study group on the Way of the Bodhisattva. I teach it, so you think I would know, but anyway. We would hope that you could be able to join either of those. A new meditation class begins March 18th from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, this is virtual, so if you're interested, contact the temple and I will sign you up. Lastly, I would like to speak about the beginning of our precepts classes. Each year, in the springtime, we have a series of 8 classes, getting people ready to formally become Buddhists and to take the precepts. So if you're curious about this, informational meetings will be offered on March 28th, April 4th, and April 18th. Those informational meetings will be right after Sunday morning service at noon Eastern Time. And the classes will begin on April 25th. Finally, I, as always, express gratitude for your being engaged in our Sangha in many ways, financial contributions, sending us letters, cards, just being present for Sunday service. So thank you so much. And now, Haji Sunam for the 4 great vows.
Such a rich morning. My thanks to you, Jaguar, if you're still there. I guess my question is, or my wonder is, if we do a lot of hand washing, hopefully that sanmat is still present and being passed on, even during difficult times. So please repeat after me the 4 great vows. All beings, one body, I vow to liberate. Blind passions, one root, I vow to terminate. Dharma gates, one mind, I vow to penetrate. The great way of Buddha, I vow to realize. May this well, just beginning to feel a little spring fever that's in the air, especially when the sun shines.